Hey, my name's Liam. I'm going to be giving a book presentation on the Book of Pastoral Rule. This was a book written by St. Gregory the Great, who was the 64th Pope of the Church in the 6th century, and this specifically was it was a book written in Latin. So we have a translation by George E. Demacopoulos, and he's translated it into the English language for us. The original book itself was written in 4 parts, although this specific modern translation includes the letter that kind of introduced the specific manuscript that we got for this book was inside of a letter. So there was an introduction letter, and then there's also a introduction for this book itself written by the translator that gives you some historical context for why and how it was written, some details on just Gregory and his life and where his position was in the church, and then also just a couple notes on what he changed or did not change to make sure that this is a faithful translation, but it's also readable in the English language. It was originally broken up into 4 parts, although 5 to 6 if you count the letter and then also the introduction. Part 1 kind of discusses the qualifications for those coming into a pastoral role. Part 2 details the lives of pastors and how they're supposed to live. Part 3 deals with how the pastor might teach and advise his congregation. And then part 4 is a very short warning about how the preacher should not allow his position to kind of develop into pride. The fact that we are preaching should not develop pride in the person. I'm going to discuss all of those in a little bit here when I get into the strengths and weaknesses of the book. But I think I'm going to give you just a broad overview in case you're thinking about checking out this book. You haven't ever read it before. I think this book does a couple things right, and if you are looking for something that's going to be useful for you to understand maybe a deeper and more historical thought on what it means to be a pastor and how to do that correctly, I think this book kind of gives you a good view of that. It's also fairly comprehensive. It adds various struggles that we think we might come across in ministry. There are a lot of individual situations that this book addresses, so it might be useful for you for that as well if you want to draw some wisdom there. A couple things that I think this book is less useful for is that it's not going to be as useful for anyone who doesn't want to come to this with a healthy understanding of the time and people who it was written to. The historical and cultural time period of St. Gregory it's fairly different than our own, and particularly how the church was set up. One example is that we don't tend to deal with ascetic monks now in Western Protestant Reformed churches. Most of our potential pastoral candidates are not monks that are living a set aside lifestyle. So some of the background of this book is not going to be immediately applicable, is what I'm basically saying. But why don't we get into the meat of it? Actually, I wanted to say one other thing. They have some theological differences, I think, from modern Western Protestant Christianity, which is my section of Christianity, the kind that I am going into. But there are a couple things like the theology of proper use of allegory, or even just how we view virtue and the standard of living. Those are a little different, so there might be some situations where that prevents direct application as well. But hopefully, if anybody hasn't read this book and is looking to, that might give you enough to figure out the backbone of whether you want to crack this thing open or not. Why don't we get into the strengths and weaknesses? Instead of going through the entire list of strengths and the entire list of weaknesses, I'm just going to go through each of the parts individually and then tell you what's good about them and then what's kind of bad about them. For the introduction, I found the introduction, the section right here, largely just helpful. The introduction gives a brief overview of St. Gregory and the history before writing this book, and discusses his career within the church. I kind of said that already. But it also gives understanding of some of the cultural norms that are present during this time and why he's addressing those particular issues. We come to find through the context of this book is mostly written to convince monks who have this rich and developed theology, right? He's trying to get them to come out of a lifestyle of seclusion and help teach the common people. And then instead of leaving that task to people who really have no theological depth, there's these two sections of people and they're not really crossing over. A healthy comparison to now might be, theologians inside of PhD level work, and then, lay pastors who have not gone to school. And he's just trying to encourage those academics basically to, academic is not the right word, but he's trying to convince them to help with the laity or the common people. He gives a couple other details about the historical and cultural background, but he describes, and when I say he, I'm talking about the translator. He describes a couple of the individual things that he tweaked inside of where he stayed true to the original transcript and where he made any corrections or took a word choice that makes it easier to read. And I don't have too much to say about the introduction's weaknesses, other than it deals with some intellectual topics that some people might find boring. But it's by far and large easier to read than the rest of the book. So if you can't get through that part of the introduction, I would say probably this book isn't for you. The letter at the beginning of the pastoral book is also, I'm pretty neutral about it because, and that's this part, the letter to Bishop John. It's basically him just introducing the book and kind of giving John, this is my advice for helping people be better pastors or convincing people to become pastors. It's a very small section of the book, so it's not super in the way or anything. The first part of the book is labeled Concerning the Qualifications of the One Who Comes to a Position of Spiritual Leadership. He doesn't do very brief titles. They're a little heavy. The shortest one is this one, and that's still quite long. But for the strength of this section, I think that Gregory does a really great job of putting an emphasis on the high standard that comes along with the position of teaching others. He places proper concern on the people who might consider coming to this position. He's also puts a strong emphasis on not doing it wrong, right? Like anyone who come to this position with a very relaxed attitude is, not doing it correctly. There's good enough emphasis on that. That's my win takeaway from this section. That being said, though, I also find it to be oriented to a different societal expectation than what I'm personally used to. This stems from him to try and engage in a group of people to become pastors who are coming from a very set apart and focused lifestyle. I've talked about the aesthetics enough already. But that kind of high calling, the place where these monks have already kind of gotten to, might be kind of a high standard to assume that anyone from our society to maybe match. We don't generally have monks, or we don't deal with them too much. And this is just a note for maybe all the other following sections. There is quite a bit of allegory in this. It starts in this section and then continues on throughout most of the book. But I think he can probably make most of the points that he's making from Scripture without reducing, the Scripture to something that it doesn't really mean. That's one of my biggest complaints about the book, actually, in general, is that the allegory is a little out of hand, but it's very normal and very popular in the time that he's writing this book, so we just kind of have to take that in stride. Part 2 is labeled Concerning the Life of the Pastor, right here. This section has much more to do about how the pastor operates in his office, and I think much of what he spells out in this section is pretty useful. My only real complaint about this section was that it's a quite extensive list of stuff that would be hard to be doing all of the time. It's maybe more of a perfect ideal of what we need to strive to instead of something that I would say is a list of musts in some cases. Some of it are probably musts, but if we only worked with flawless people, we would work with no people. Part 3 is labeled how the spiritual director who lives well should teach and advise the laity. This section details many individuals that the pastor might come across and minister to. This one is actually quite helpful because I think it provides a large amount of advice for very specific situations, and it's organized in a way that's easy enough to access. For example, if you wanted to hear St. Gregory's thoughts on how we're supposed to minister to people who are easily provoked, right? To one who is easily provoked. It's not too hard to find that section of this book and then review it. It's not super long on either of these sections. It's brief and understandable. It's organized in pairs of people which are in some way related to each other in Gregory's eyes. This is great for organization and memorization, but I think this also provides a little bit of a drawback because it might be making correlations that are not necessarily completely true to reality, right? It could just be the way that Gregory is seeing and viewing this, and it might not completely connect with how the lazy and those who are self-concerned are connected. That's not one he necessarily makes, but some of them come across as like that disconnected. Additionally, I think that the culture and the history affects this area a little bit more too, because it deals with so many different people that you might be dealing with that inevitably the setting that you might be involved with those kind of people kind of twists his word. It gets into his words a little bit. It changes his perspective, and we just have to be aware of that when translating it to someone now. The last part is labeled, this is the biggest title of them all, that the preacher, after he has done everything that is required, should return to himself so that he does not take pride in his life or preaching. This section, despite it having the longest name, is actually quite small. It's basically just a couple pages at the end of the book. I understand why he put it there. And maybe didn't include it inside of, this probably could have been included inside of part 2, just like this is something you need to be aware of as a pastor, but he ends it that way so that like after we do the preaching to people, there's a reminder basically. I think it is an important thing to end it off with, and I have no real problem with it, so I do find that useful as well. But that kind of concludes my book review on the Book of Pastoral Rule. I found it helpful, but more in a contextual sort of way. I think I understand the roots of pastoral care that we kind of see nowadays, but I don't feel that it is as helpful as some of the other modern books that I've read. Even the book so I read this book for one of my classes, and the other book I read was The Pastor as Public Theologian. I believe the author's name is Van Hooser. But I found that one more helpful because it really applied more to modern situations and phrased it in a way that I thought was easier to digest. My main suggestion for anyone who is thinking about cracking this book open would be to temper it just a little bit, right? If you're looking for just one book to teach you how to be a pastor, unless you're really versed in church history and understand a lot of the historical context anyway, maybe choose a different book. But this is a great book to crack into if you're going to be reading a lot of books on pastoral leadership and pastoral rule. But if you take your time and learn from a lot of other sources, I think this thing is great for supplemental stuff, and it gives you more of appreciation for history too, which I think is also pretty important. I am just about at 15 minutes, so I'm going to end it here. That was the book report. Thank you.